Before we get started with today's podcast, I want to take this opportunity to ask you when the last time it was that you changed out the air filter in your home. Now, would you believe that most people don't change out their air filters monthly or even know that they have to change them out monthly or until they realize that something is actually wrong with their HVAC system? That's why I want to introduce to you Second Nature air filters. Now, what's so special about them? Not only are they effective at capturing the dust, pollens, the molds, the bacteria, but they also help reduce the energy usage of your HVAC system up to 15% and avoid costly repairs whenever it matters the most. But let's be real. The real reason you're not changing your air filters, is because you forget half the time. You're like how I used to be. That's why I went with Second Nature air filters. Second Nature has created a subscription plan to send your home's air filters each month right to your door, which forces you to change out your old air filters before the new one arrives, keeping your air clean and your HVAC system in working condition. I've certainly noticed that regular replacement of my home's air filters has reduced the amount of dust flying around in my place, but has also reduced how much I've been sneezing in my place. Before, I was changing out my air filter every 3 months and I was sneezing constantly. Now that I change out my filter monthly, I hardly ever sneeze. This is all thanks to Second Nature's filter subscription plan, and it's the one delivery that I actually look forward to every month. Get started with Second Nature air filters today with my referral link at thepodcasttherapist.com/secondnature.
Mixdown Media Productions.
Today's episode of The Podcast Therapist comes ad-free and in its complete form at thepodcasttherapist.com/ad-free.
When you're one unbalanced piece of audio from losing your shit. This is The Podcast Therapist.
Welcome back to another episode of The Podcast Therapist. I'm your host, the Shan Man, radio broadcaster, podcaster, and podcast producer. And boy, do I got a really great podcast interview for you today. I'm speaking with my friend Jimmie Whisman. He is one half of the duo of the Crime and Sports podcast and the Small Town Murder podcast. He hosts this podcast along with his friend James Pietragallo, and I am, I guess you could say I just consider Jimmie to be one of my friends, a good friend, even though I know he has way better friends, but I've seen Jimmie grow his podcast with James to heights that I never could even imagine. And so I thought it would be great to bring Jimmie on to this podcast and share some inspiration for you, the person who is creating a podcast. Doesn't matter whether you're in the true crime niche, doesn't matter if you are in the fitness niche, it does not matter what niche you are in. I think hearing someone else's experience from a point of view or from a perspective in which they have seen success is very important. And I think what is important about the statement that I just made is that it's not just about the success that Jimmie and James have gained over time with their podcast, but it's about what you'll hear Jimmie talk about in today's podcast when it comes down to not forgetting where he came from when he started this podcast with his best friend, James. So it's going to be not only inspirational, it's going to have a little bit of humor and laughs. Just as a heads up for you, you should have seen on this podcast that it is marked as explicit. I mean, explicit sometimes for me is when I mention a cuss word, but we're going to hear a few cuss words in this podcast, and there's nothing wrong with that. I have no problem sharing that type of content. But I think what the meat is of this podcast is that you're going to hear about a 5-year journey to podcasting success to the point to where Jimmie and James now do this as basically a part of their lives. It is like their job, basically. James does this basically full time. Jimmie does this full time, basically. So you're going to hear this 5-year journey of how and what it took to get to that point, and starting with nothing and eventually getting to the point to where they get a call from some agent to tell them, hey, we want you to take your podcast out on the road. We want you to tour the United States to record live podcasts. I remember getting that text from Jimmie saying that he and James had got a call from an agent. I remember getting that text. I think I still have that text. And I could not believe it because I had heard their story. I had heard how they had created their very first podcast. I had heard how discouraged James was when they first started their podcast, Crime and Sports. And you're going to hear some of that in today's episode. Today's going to be an abbreviated episode, just so you know. Next week, I'll share part 2 of it, but you'll hear a lot more about that journey in today's episode. We'll take a peek into the difference or the philosophy behind why they create longer podcasts and whether longer podcasts are better for their audience or whether shorter podcasts perform better for their audience. The value of work ethic is something that we get into in today's podcast, and Jimmie is going to share the single most important piece of advice that will help you create a successful podcast. And then what happens when these guys are faced up against life, when it makes it difficult for them to launch or to, I shouldn't say launch, but to release a podcast episode. Just like you who's listening to this podcast, sometimes you might find that you have a hard time delivering a podcast because life happens. I mean, we just experienced that a couple weeks ago from me where my hard drive went down and it was like hell or high water that I had to get a podcast episode out just to let you know that I wasn't being honest or that I wasn't being dishonest with you. I just had to, I could not do my podcast. So it was hell or high water. Get a podcast episode out. All my content was on my hard drive. Thankfully, that was recovered. We learned a little bit about that in today's episode, but you're going to hear how James and Jimmie deal with this. And we will dip our toes into what sponsorships mean to the true crime duo on Crime and Sports and Small Town Murder and what that looks like when it comes down to monetizing your podcast. These guys have created such valuable content that now when sponsors come to them, well, I'll let Jimmie explain what that looks like for their podcast and what it might look like for your podcast. Hopefully this gives you some ideas of what it should look like for your podcast. But overall, I was just happy to have Jimmie in this episode. It was a Friday night. I recorded this actually on Friday. I'm recording this on Monday. So I recorded this on this last Friday with him. He had just gotten back from dinner with his daughter. We were supposed to record the night before, and then, of course, that just could not happen. My schedule has been all messed up. I have been working days all last week at the radio station, but I was happy that I was able to give this podcast interview, or actually capture this podcast interview, because I think you will find it valuable and you will love to hear what Jimmie has to say about podcasting. So we'll come up with that interview here very shortly. You're listening to The Podcast Therapist. To get the uninterrupted and ad-free version of this podcast, visit thepodcasttherapist.com/ad-free.
The Podcast Therapist.
You've heard me talk a lot about podcast monetization on this podcast and even on my YouTube channel. And to be honest, I've only scratched the surface when I talk about it. As I've said in those episodes, is that if you're starting a podcast, there's the likely objective that you want to turn it into some type of income. After all, you're buying the equipment and services, and that all comes at a cost. So it's better to have a plan to turn your efforts into a return on your investment. That's why I created my audiobook, The 6 Clever Ways to Monetize a Podcast. This audiobook reveals a deeper understanding of monetization that is used in the radio industry and how podcasters are already utilizing these strategies to create lines of income. When you listen, you will learn to identify 3 critical programming components to create multiple opportunities within one single podcast. You'll also learn philosophies taken from the radio industry that teach you the methodology behind podcast programming to earn more sales. And I'll even talk about getting your first sponsors and how you don't need to have thousands of downloads to secure a sponsor on your podcast. But you'll also learn that sponsorships are more than just monetization. Getting sponsorships is often misdirected and confused by the average podcaster or influencer who hasn't spent a day actually creating and developing programming elements within a day-to-day program. As you'll learn in my audiobook, legitimate monetization is executed through research and strategy. The 6 Clever Ways to Monetize a Podcast is 2.5 hours of juicy insider information that you aren't getting from average podcasters. To get your copy, head to thepodcasttherapist.com/audiobook73 to get 73% off this audiobook. Getting serious serious about monetizing your podcast means getting educated the right way with the right information. Head to thepodcasttherapist.com/audiobook73 to grab your copy today. Disclaimer, there's no guarantee that you will make certain levels of income. By purchasing, you accept the risk that earnings and income statements differ by individual. As with any business, your results may vary and will be based on your individual capacity, business experience, and expertise. Attention video podcasters. You've heard that publishing your program to YouTube is a huge opportunity if you're looking to get discovered. After all, who doesn't want their program to be discovered on the second largest search engine in the world? But the journey of getting discovered on YouTube can actually be very frustrating. Maybe you've been publishing your podcast program to your channel, but you're not getting very much traction to any of your videos other than maybe having your mom, maybe your best friend. Those are the people that are watching your videos. So to fix this, there are a couple things that you should be doing to start getting more views to your channel. Number one, publish actual videos of your podcast or podcast interviews instead of using a static image with audio. YouTube tends to prefer videos where objects are moving, such as motion pictures or animation. And number two, you should be using TubeBuddy to get an edge on the competition to target the right keywords and long tail phrases that people are actually searching for when they are inside of YouTube. Since rebooting my YouTube channel and implementing TubeBuddy, I was able to grow from 900 subscribers to over 10,000 along with 700,000 views, and that continues to grow. Not only did TubeBuddy help me target the right keywords for my audience, but their suite of tools helped me optimize my videos to get more subscribers, views, and drive more traffic back to my website and podcast, in turn helping me maximize my video development efforts to drive more business back to my website. TubeBuddy is filled with a ton of shortcut tools that turn your video publishing efforts from spending hours to mere minutes, so you can spend more time creating more podcasts for your channel and help you get discovered. When people ask me what my secret is to my YouTube success, I tell them it's two things: pure consistency and TubeBuddy. To give TubeBuddy a test drive today, head to my TubeBuddy affiliate link at thepodcasttherapist.com/TubeBuddy. Above all things, your website is the most important asset to any venture that you're starting, especially if you're getting serious about it. After all, when you make the decision to start a podcast, you're making the decision to start a business, and having a website should be the top priority, even if you've launched a podcast before you've launched your website. There are a ton of website platforms that you can use, but the one that I recommend for anyone who is serious about starting a podcasting business should go with Kajabi. Kajabi is an all-in-one website platform that makes it easy for podcast business owners to create a website without having to know coding or design. Long gone are the days of having to reach out to a designer to make a critical change to your website if you're on a timeline. And when it comes to all those third-party apps that you'd have to connect with other website platforms, Kajabi makes it simple by including their own apps that won't cost you extra money or even break without you knowing it. Kajabi is armed with tools for email marketing that includes form box creation for a clean website look, landing and sales page pipelines to help drive more sales to your products and services. And right out of the box, they give you sample sales copy to help you get a jumpstart on getting people to buy your digital products, services, or memberships. They also give you tools to create multiple sales offers and coupons, payment integration and coding, membership software, customizable themes, and so much more. The difference between other website platforms and Kajabi is that Kajabi makes the entire process of building and maintaining your website a breeze. You'll save hours, days, and even weeks from having to tie third-party apps to other website platforms just to make sure they're operating seamlessly. Kajabi's internal ecosystem of apps never break, and they're always being upgraded to help you become more successful. Give Kajabi a try through my affiliate link at thepodcasttherapist.com/Kajabi. Save yourself all the headaches that will come with other website platforms and build your website the right way from the start. Again, go to thepodcasttherapist.com/Kajabi to get started today. Today's episode of The Podcast Therapist is brought to you by the Adobe Creative Cloud. Creativity is everywhere, and all you need are the right tools to turn those creative ideas into reality. Whether it's building stunning new artwork to promote your podcast, editing simple videos for your video podcast, or stepping up your audio production game, the Adobe Creative Cloud gives you access to Adobe's entire suite of software products that will enhance your content creation across all digital platforms. Go to thepodcasttherapist.com/Adobe to learn more and get started today. Today's interview of The Podcast Therapist was created using StreamYard. StreamYard helps you create seamless recordings of your podcast interviews, or you can stream them live to multiple platforms like Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, LinkedIn, or even Periscope. You can learn more about StreamYard through my affiliate link at thepodcasttherapist.com/StreamYard.
Mixdown. It's time for the Mixdown. The Podcast Therapist.
Okay, so we are here with the one and only, and I would like to call him the Snob Vila of Phoenix, Arizona. He is one of two hosts of the podcast Crime and Sports and Small Town Murder. The very delicious tonight, because you went out and had delicious food and you're looking just as delicious, my friend. Jimmie Whisman from Crime and Sports and Small Town Murder. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing very well. I've got my daughter, and we made chicken parmesan tonight. My son wanted to do things otherwise, so we just ended up doing it just by ourselves. And then she picked out a bottle of wine for me, so I'm good and drunk for this.
So did you finish the bottle of wine? That's the question.
I will when we're done with this.
So for those who don't know, we are recording this on a Friday night, March 19th. Jimmie, he said he's nice and easy for me tonight. So it's going to be a real fun, easy interview.
Kind of casual, Shannon.
Super casual.
Yeah.
So again, I want to thank you for coming on to the Podcast Therapist. And you're someone who I've wanted to talk with because you are someone who has started from the very I wouldn't say rock bottom, but the very bottom.
For sure.
Right?
You got it right.
I guess
we
rock bottom.
Started with nothing.
Right. And I want and that's the thing, is that people who come to my YouTube channel or they message me or they send me an Instagram message, they always say like, well, this is too hard. It's a struggle. I don't know what to do. I don't think this is worth it. And you and your partner, James Pietragallo, you guys are like the true, you're the true Hollywood story in a good light, right? You guys are the ones that have started from the bottom and have seen this thing to success. So I want to go in and start with the backstory of your two podcasts, Crime and Sports and Small Town Murder. First of all, how did the idea of you guys starting a podcast ever come to be?
Yeah, that's just, it's essentially right now. And the way the world is today, it's a podcast world. A guy named Brant Tobler, he's a comedian who's a terrific comedian. That's like his go-to phrase is it's a podcast world. And if you don't have a podcast now, and you're still making fun of comics who have podcasts, you're already behind. That's the first thing. But second, when James and I started this, it wasn't like this, what it is today. 5 years ago, it was a little less saturated, quite a bit less saturated. Today, it's bananas. But when we started, it was pretty saturated, but we figured doing the route we were going to do with comedy and crime and sports, making fun of athletes who have had a fall from grace and really just thrown away things that they didn't have to throw away, doing things that they didn't have to do. And we made fun of them. Every week we picked a different athlete, and there was plenty. And that kept going, and that was growing, and that's our baby. That's the one that we love the most. But we decided that we were going to start a second podcast with Small Town Murder and just doing murders in very small towns that nobody had ever heard of. Like, there's plenty of podcasts to talk about Jeffrey Dahmer or Ed Gein or whatever. These famous comedians, famous murderers, Jack the Ripper. There's tons of them, and almost every true crime podcast ends up covering that. So James and I want to do something different, and there wasn't anybody doing comedy with crime other than Karen and Georgia, and so we decided we were going to do it on our own and do a different way and different take. And with Small Town Murder, we ended up really profiling a small town and giving you what it's like to our best through James's investigation of what it's like to live there, lifestyle there, whether it's a silly festival or what the houses cost or whether or not they vote Democrat or Republican majority in the town. Spoiler alert, in small towns, it's vastly Republican.
Right.
We found that.
Yes, I come from a small town, I know.
So we tried our best to just give you a shape and an overview of what it's like to live there. And then once we give you that, then we give you a horrible event that ruined that entire way of life and made people start locking doors at night. And we don't do it to make fun of a horrible situation. We do it if James and I could just do a show called Small Towns and people would listen to that shit, we'd do that.
Yeah.
The fact is, we need a hook where people will listen and a good riveting story. And James and I both are from tragic past where he's had tragedy in his life in the shape of murder of his family, and I've had tragedy in my life in the shape of I was robbed at gunpoint, duct taped, and stuck in a walk-in freezer. I was molested as a child. I grew up in a household where molestation was happening. I've experienced tragedy too on a different scale that more people, I think, have been affected by than murder probably. And if not more, it's absolutely a comparable number. And so we chose that route. Now, Small Town Murder quickly outpaced Crime and Sports, and we started having an audience for that. And we were kind of upset by that because Crime and Sports is the one that we love the most, and we love doing it. But Small Town Murder became a beast of its own, and we have to chase that beast also and turn that into everything that we can for it. And in the interim, we've come to love it as well, and we've expanded the show where we started at 30 minutes and now it's grown to some of our shows are 2.5 hours, 3 hours. Some of our episodes get really, really long, but we wanted it when we started to just be like a lunch break podcast. And it turned into something entirely different, and I'm fine with that too. As it grows, you've got to grow with it or change the direction of it. And if you don't do that, then the show's either gonna suffer or you're gonna suffer, one way or another. If the show suffers, then you also suffer. So we let the show grow the way it wanted to grow and how the audience wanted to grow. And then we've toured that one a lot more than Crime and Sports. We've only done a few live shows of Crime and Sports, but Small Town Murder, we've toured the entire country 3-4 times. And without COVID, we'd have done it again. And
I want to get into that. And the opportunities that you've had with touring and all that. I want to really kind of stick first with this idea of growth. But, you mentioned that the podcast, you wanted them as being like lunchtime podcasts. And how did you recognize that a longer podcast would do much better for your audience?
It's fascinating. Just watching James is it's why I'm so proud to be in business with a man like him. It's because he's dedicated to like stats and figures and numbers, and he keeps an eye on that stuff. He keeps an eye on whether or not people listen to an episode from Indiana versus how many people listen to something from Mississippi versus how many people listen to something from somewhere else. So we try to spread it around the country, but we also strategically pick stories from specific areas based on what the audience wants. And then on top of that, watching the length of the show and comparing those numbers to a shorter show and seeing where they stack up. And by far and away, it's not even close. The long shows have 10, 20, 30,000 more downloads each week in the first week. It's really.
What do you think it is about those longer shows that allow?
What it is, Jen. They want your fucking blood.
You're like, oh my God, I've built so much content. They want more.
What I think it is, honestly, I think it's people that sit in an office and they listen to shows. And they have an 8-hour day that they have to put in. And the longer the show, the more of that 8 hours of a place that they don't want to be, it chews up that time. And they're thankful for it. And they listen again and again and again because it takes up so much more time. Look, Joe Rogan puts out 5-hour shows. And I think it's because people that listen to those during the day, or truckers that listen on long hauls, people that have hours to sit and don't want to do exactly what they're doing, would rather kill that time with people that they associate with. They can see something about whatever they identify with or whatever they're interested in. That's what they'll sit and listen to it. And I'm so thankful for people like that, because without them, these shows don't exist.
Right. And the funny thing about true crime and the idea of true crime, I remember diving into the true crime niche when Serial first came out, because it was very story-like oriented, right? Yeah. But then I started seeing more true crime podcasts coming out, and then of course that was when you and I first met, and you guys were like, oh yeah, we do a true crime podcast. It's a comedy podcast. And I thought, well, that's an interesting take. Like, how do you create comedy out of tragedy, but you guys got your own way of doing that. And what I found interesting after learning about you guys and knowing you, and then there was a point in time when you actually were coming down to the KUPD studios and recording, and I had seen kind of the process of how you guys came up with content, how James came up with his content. Can you explain, can you kind of visualize and share with the audience what that looked like as far as what he did to create that content?
Thankfully, James and I are both stand-up comics, and we've been comedians for the better part of 10 years. And that's how I know Brant Tobler. I don't think I even mentioned that earlier, that he's a comedian. And there's people just like, who the hell is Brant Tobler? Right. Brant Tobler is a comedian that James and I know through comedy because we're both comedians. Mm-hmm. That's how we came up with podcasting as an idea and an avenue to build something, because all these comedians that we opened for had podcasts, and we wanted to also do that. But a lot of comedians have podcasts that are built on having guests and having their famous guests. And James and I, being Phoenix comedians, we only work the clubs every couple of weeks or once a month or whatever. And if we're going to have a show every week, who are we're not going to have Harlan Williams and Bill Burr and Bert Kreischer isn't coming to my house. Right. Joe Rogan doesn't care about what James Pietragallo and Jimmie Whisman are doing there. So we had to figure out an avenue to go where we didn't require guests, and that's the first out of the gate. And then second out of the gate was that we weren't just going to talk about comedy, because there's only so much why'd you start comedy that you can do, you know what I mean? There's only so much where did you start? Look, we're all Phoenix comedians. Where did you start? It's at an open mic, obviously. Right. That's where I started. Why? Because I hate myself. That's why. And how many times can you hear that answer? You know what I mean? So James is he was a filmmaker, and he put shows and movies in festivals and such. And he's a master at building a story arc. He knows where a twist or a plot point should be. He knows if a story is going to be good and what it takes to make a good story. Mm-hmm. And if he combs through case files and case files and case files of incidents and events that have happened, that he throws some out because look, it's a murder and it's a terrible event, and there's some things in there that are interesting, but there's nothing funny about that. And there's only so many mom drowned a baby in a bathtub that before you go, maybe society just needs to get better, and that's not that's not on us. James and I, we're comedians at the end of the day, and we're not here to change the world. We're just trying to make this world easier to deal with. Right.
And then when it comes down to like the actual physical creation of the podcast, like I've seen James with note cards. Like we're not talking like little baby note cards. We're talking like those gigantic note cards. And the last time I saw him in the studio down at the radio station, he had a plastic bag, and it was filled with note cards that were so thick. It was thick.
That was for the show that night, Shannon.
Yeah, and it was for that night. And I was like, "Are you kidding me?" And I asked him. I said, "How much time did you put into that?" And he goes, "Oh, this is like an all week thing. Like to put. I think it was like an all week thing. What? Like how long does it take for him to create
40 hours per show? And we do 2 shows a week." So it takes all week for him to get a show together. And so if it stinks, that's a waste of a lot of time. Yeah. And that's really the pressure that James and I are both under, because he's got to produce an idea for us to talk about for a show. And then I come in sight unseen, not knowing anything of what's happening in this story. And I have to react along with it. Mm-hmm. And, we're basically both doing a headline set of an hour and a half, unrun, never done before. This is cut one take, Charlie. This is it. Here we go. And if this sucks, well, hopefully they stick around for next week.
So you're telling me that when you go in, record a podcast, you're not pressing stop and then going, well, let's re-record that. You're going.
No. Jesus, no. That's the worst show. If you're doing a show where it's a reactionary show, if you're cutting and editing reaction, you're doing it wrong. Mm-hmm. In my opinion, I think a reaction is a reaction, good, bad, or indifferent. It depends on how. Look, if you're going to be the reaction guy, you better have a reaction, and you better be understanding that this stuff, whatever we're talking about, isn't supposed to be happening, or there should be some sort of visceral feeling for these words.
Right.
Otherwise, it's ridiculous. And we're not trying to get the best reaction. We're just trying to get a natural, this is how I heard this, and I'm either stunned or I relate or I don't get it.
Right.
Or whatever the situation. But James and I are both very confident in the shows, and I'm thankful to be able to work with somebody who wants to do this as badly as I do, and who's as hungry as I am, and who has a work ethic that is comparable to nobody. And I've worked with, some of the funniest people on the planet. I've seen them perform. I've seen them work, and I know the work ethic of comedians. And I'll put James's work ethic up against any of these people all day, just because I know what he does, and I know what he's capable of.
Right.
And our live shows, I've seen live shows. I've worked with comedians on live shows. I know what a stand-up set looks like, and our live show competes with anybody's live show,
right.
and is better than, I believe in it. I believe it's better than 90% of podcast shows that are live.
Mm-hmm.
You can't beat our show. That's
right.
just.
I've seen the social media posts of your live shows. I've seen the magnitude that you guys of what those live shows look like. I see these pictures of fans taking pictures with you, and I'm like that dude was just in my studio. I was just at his house the other day. It's like, no, this blows my mind. But
it doesn't make any sense to me either. Coming from being a boy that grew up I grew up in central Phoenix in a terrible neighborhood, but born in a trailer, not even a park, just a trailer in Colorado Springs. I'm not anybody that is better than anybody else, and I'll never pretend that. And so when people treat us differently, it feels fucking weird, man.
I would imagine so. It's
bizarre.
And I think kind of going back to that talking about James's work ethic and all that, and what I think the difficult part is for most podcasters, I could even lump myself into this, and it doesn't have to do with podcasting. It could be with my YouTube channel, but it can be difficult to maintain that motivation. But I think the one lesson that I hear from you is that consistency has been the success of your podcasts.
Absolutely.
And
if you set a schedule for your show when you start and you say, I'm going to do this once a week, if you don't at least do it you're missing your boat. You're doing it. You're already doing yourself a disservice. You're doing your audience a disservice, because they count on. If you tell them right out of the gate, I'm going to do this once a week, and then you skip 2 weeks and you're like, sorry about those 2 weeks. I had things in my personal life, and this show doesn't pay me to do that. So you guys suffer. Why'd you do this then, man? Because you told us. You made a promise to us, and you're already going back on that promise. What are you doing?
Yeah.
And you're already being dishonest to your audience. If we miss a show for whatever reason, so far we haven't missed one without telling our audience 2 weeks or 3 weeks in advance. But if we miss one, we make sure that the next one that we are going to put out is going to be as good or better than anything we've ever done. And we try really, really hard to be honest with our audience. And if we can't, because sometimes life happens, if something happens and we can't be there, we make sure that they know and why things happen. That's just if you're going to have an audience and you want them to trust you, you can't start a trust relationship with lies. That's just
right. Yeah.
Ask your wife how that's going to work.
Right. And that what you just told me is very true, because you could take this out of the comedy or true crime niche, whatever. My brother, a few years back, I was hanging out at his house, and he's big into archery and CrossFit and all that, and he subscribes to all these podcasts, and then I would ask him, well, what do you listen to? Which podcast do you listen to? And he would tell me which podcast he listened to, and he would say well, I really like this archery podcast, but I get pissed that when the Tuesday rolls around and he doesn't have an episode for me, because that's how I base my schedule. I base my schedule around his podcast, so that if I'm doing yard work or whatever, that's what I listen to get me through, because that's when I'm listening to his podcast. So consistency and sharing the consistency with people. And even if, like what you said, when life happens, right? Yeah. Life happens. I've seen you guys even post on your Instagram or on your Facebook and say, I can't remember, it was a while back, but I think there was a computer problem or a hard drive problem. Yeah.
Holy shit, the most unbelievable event ever happens. Because look, thankfully now James doesn't have to put things on cards. We've done okay enough to get the man a laptop, so everything in there now.
Right.
But when we started, we built a studio in his basement. We had a computer that was an Acer computer with Windows on it, and Windows had an update. So we click, and we were about to record, and it just said you need an update. So James just clicks no later, and then it starts updating. He was like, it's going to update, so let's just have a break. We'll chill for a minute, then we'll come back down. So we go upstairs, we come back downstairs, and the computer is just that little rectangle in the corner is flashing. Yeah. James is like, I don't know why it's not working. So he shuts it off, turns it back up, goes back to that little rectangle working. And he's like, I don't get it. What happened? So then he starts Googling. The Windows update is not compatible for this computer. We just bought the computer like 3 weeks ago. Yeah. It's not compatible with this computer, but it deleted the operating system for this computer and then wouldn't update the new one. So now we have a computer without an operating system, and it won't take the new operating system. So we had nothing.
Right.
We were screwed. We had to go buy a new computer and get a new operating system built into it so that we could do this all over again. So thankfully, I have a cousin that works for Apple, and she sent us one like now.
Yeah.
And we were able to take care of that later. But the next day we had a computer. So we were able to I think we put Small Town Murder out that week, but not Crime and Sports. And, thankfully people understood, but man, that's an event, that's life happening, and you have zero control. And the really the heartbreak, because I was upset, James was upset, he had 40 hours put into this damn thing, and we can't even do it. And it's not through any fault of his own or any fault of mine or any lack of desire or drive. It's just technology shafted us, and that's just sometimes that happens, man.
I mean, that happened to me a couple weeks ago. I dropped my external hard drive, and that destroyed my life for a week because I just couldn't. I was like, I had to go on. I mean, I messaged my people on YouTube, and I created a podcast that was 15-20 minutes long, and I still maybe I didn't give the most to that podcast, but I did what I could, right? Because
we booked a live show in Nashville. And James flew the day before I left. He went up to Denver and across to Nashville, landed safely. I booked a flight later, and I was going over to Dallas-Fort Worth and then over to Nashville. And I got to Dallas-Fort Worth, and then all of a sudden an act of God happens, and they ground every plane for the next 2 days. And I couldn't get out of there. Then I go to rent a car, and I can't rent a car. They're all rented. And I sat in that airport for 36 hours until I could get another plane I flew from Dallas to Houston to Detroit, back down to Nashville. And I got to the show 20 minutes before the live show. But there's another show that almost didn't happen because of an act of God.
Yeah.
And had that happen, there were safety measures in place. They would have had Dan Cummins and James. The audience would have been fine. Yeah. But I wouldn't have been there, so it would have been a different show. Yeah. Maybe for the better, but a different show.
All right. Yeah, it would have changed completely without you. Yeah. Yeah, it would have changed completely.
So the thing is, acts of God happen. Events happen with technology. Mm-hmm. You have kids. You have a job. You have things in your life. If your podcast isn't paying your bills at the moment and something happens in your life and it seems more interesting or more fun to do rather than make that podcast because it's not paying bills, you've got to be able to weigh those options and understand that it may not pay the bills right now, but who's to say that time and patience and an audience built won't later? And James and I are a testament to tell you today. I mean, there was a Thursday, our second or first Thursday that we put a show out. We had 12 downloads, and James was like, I guess that's it. We shut this thing off and never do this again. And I was like, we got to give it a chance, man. It's not.
Yeah, I remember you being the major encourager of saying, like, no, we got to keep going.
Got to keep going, man. You can't stop. And comedy is the same way. James and I both know that. If you do an open mic, your first open mic, and you suck, you're gonna quit now, or you're gonna try again. Yeah. Give it. I mean, you got to give it a year. If it doesn't pick up in a year, it's probably shit.
And I think it will if someone creates a podcast and sticks with it for at least a year. You commit to a year, you're going to see growth in downloads. It just happens.
If you have 50 episodes, I guarantee you, A, you're a better podcaster at number 50 than you were at number 1. B, you've got a bigger audience at 50 than number 1. And C, your audience after number 51 is happier than audience after number 1.
Right.
I won't. I refuse. You couldn't pay me money to listen to the first podcast that James and I put out, where people will tweet us and tell us how in awe they are of our first podcast versus where we are today. There is no way I will listen to that, because I will.
As I recall, you guys were recording it on a video camera, right?
Yeah.
You were
we recorded on a video camera, ripped the audio, and then James would edit like music tracks or whatever in, and then upload that.
Yeah.
And we recorded on lapel mics also. So the audio was trash. The story, thank Christ, James is an unbelievable story arc writer. Otherwise, we would have been in a lot of trouble. And I was terrified because we were still not super respected comedians. We were regulars at the clubs here, and people liked us, but there's a new crop of comedians every 6 months, and the new ones think you're an asshole every time. And after a few 6-month periods, you got a year and a half of people that think you're a dick. People start disliking you or start holding grudges because they can't get spots at clubs. Yeah. And James and I we're not doing headline spots. We're talking about we're hosting. Right. We're getting the occasional feature spot. It's not money. We're not making big money, but we're making maximized money really at that portion of our comedy journey. And now, thankfully, with the audience we've built, that's really been the goal, is building an audience that understands what we do. Not just on our podcast, but understands our type of humor and what they could expect if they came to see us do our own stand-up live. So if we end up meandering away from the podcast journey, which I don't foresee happening, because it's just so much fun. Why do stand-up every damn day when you have so much fun with your best friend?
And I hear comics talk about that same thing. They say, like, why would I want to do stand-up when I could just do my podcast?
Right. It's so much more fun.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there is that direct response when you tell a joke and it's something that you thought and something that you created, and an audience gives it a right now reaction to that. There's nothing that substitutes that.
Right.
There really isn't. People being approving of something that you say right now is so rewarding.
Right.
And I'm thankful to have that opportunity now that I could go tour. I could go book a weekend somewhere if I want to. And I could draw an audience and people would be there for me. And I can't wait till that day happens where I can do a podcast weekend. I can go do a stand-up weekend. I can go do a podcast weekend. And the money that I'd make from comedy and from stand-up would be very rewarding, and it would be something I might cherish a little bit more. Granted, I'm doing something with James that I would never give away for a million years.
Yeah, you guys are like blood brothers. I mean, yeah, man. He's like inseparable.
I just understand the guy.
Yeah,
and he understands me, and he sees where I come from, and there's nothing that I would never ever backstab the man, or I won't jeopardize anything that his worth or his self-interest. Is that a word? That's not what it is. I don't know what the word I'm looking for. But I'm not jeopardizing his career path or his trajectory based on some stupid bullshit selfish need when I need nothing. I'm broke. I come from broke, and I don't need anything, and I'm fine. And I'm fine being decent, just bills paid. I'm fine with that.
Sure. Let's move into this idea of growth of the podcast. And, when you guys first started out with Crime and Sports, I remember you were being sponsored by someone. I don't remember who it was, but you were being sponsored by someone or something. And then
we had an ad company with, I don't know that I need to mention them necessarily, but it was a trouble relationship. It wasn't great.
Right.
But it's because they were in some tax haven somewhere, and they were a slow pay company, and we started getting annoyed with that. So we ended up having our audience tweet about it, and our audience got us paid, thankfully. It wasn't a lot of money, but it was enough money to where a guy like me and a guy like James, where that money changed our lives. It was definitely that. It wasn't anywhere where like anybody would think about suing over, but it was definitely money that could fix a lot in my life, and it did. And thankfully we were able to get beyond that.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And then we moved into a different company that did fine for us and had us a guarantee in the return, in ads return. And that was nice, and it was great, and it was rewarding, and we learned from it. And then we ended up with an agent who saw worth in us that was beyond that, and so he got us a contract with another ad company, which has been really everything, that the whole reason that we started.
So let me back up real quick. So before the sponsorship started coming, when did you realize that sponsorships were going to be part of your guys' game? Because there's multiple ways which you can make money with your podcast. I think you of all people know that this is the way, and you guys started with sponsorships. Does it have to start with sponsorships, or can it go start somewhere else? Like, how did you know that sponsorships was the thing that you guys had to go with?
So at that point we needed it because James and I, again, back to how James and I view ourselves. We don't think that anybody should ever pay for what we do. That's how we viewed it and how we felt. We didn't think we were worth anybody's money. We wanted an audience, and we wanted people loyal to us, and we didn't want to lie to them. So when we got ads, we didn't want to get we wanted to be able to approve the ads and not just sell people things just for the sake of making money.
Right.
We wanted to do this the right way and do it on our terms. And thankfully, the ad companies that we've gotten have let us pick the ads, or at least turn down ads, have the right of refusal. That was huge for us. Because we, at the end of the day, we don't want to do ads for vape pens. You know what I mean? I don't want to tell a kid that the blue e-cigarette is better than whatever Fuse is out there. Yeah. Because to be honest with you, A, I don't know. B, that's disgusting. And C, they give me a sinus infection. Right. And so I can't, you don't want me singing the praises of your product if it gives me a sinus infection.
Right. Right.
But we chose ads in regards to like meal prep delivery and stuff like that, things that we believed in, things that we used, and we were okay with that. But then when we found an avenue in terms of giving extra content to people that wanted it via Patreon, that's when we started to see a path that was entirely different from anything else. Whereas ads, you can make money and you can be fine with it, and you can make enough money depending on the size of your audience. You can make enough money to really just go on your way and be fine. But with Patreon, you can choose a path to be beholden to your audience. You can choose a path to really give them something that you feel is worth it, and you can make your own product that you think is worth money. And when you build something that you think is worth money and then people pay for it, that's where the reward really
So what would you say if you were to help someone brand new jumping into this game, and they came to you and they said, "Oh, Jimmie, I really want sponsorships for my podcast. What do I do? Do I get sponsorships first?" What advice would you give them first? To hear this episode in its entirety, grab the ad-free version at thepodcasttherapist.com/ad-free.
The Podcast Therapist.
Right now, you might be in the middle of the research phase of launching your podcast. Maybe you've gotten some equipment, signed up for a Zoom account, and have recorded a few podcast episodes. But what steps do you need to take when it comes to a successful podcast launch? Would you believe the biggest mistake podcasters make is the launch sequence? Seriously, just like a space shuttle has a sequence to put astronauts into space, podcasts have sequences to put a podcast in the marketplace successfully. That's why I created the podcast launch checklist. After helping numerous clients build their podcasts, I developed a step-by-step guide to help podcast creators just like you have a clean launch sequence without wasting time. The podcast launch checklist is a 12-step sequence that walks you through the pre-launch, mid-launch, and post-launch process with specific steps and instructions that will save you time. If you're tired of walking around in the dark trying to figure out everything that comes with a podcast launch, you can grab the podcast launch checklist today. Visit thepodcasttherapist.com/PLC and use the code PODTherapist, all one word, to get 25% off this checklist today. You always hear me talk about the importance of having your podcast transcribed and placed on your website so that your podcast can be discovered with Google, right? But the idea of getting your podcast transcribed with different transcription-only services can cost a ton of money, or it can waste a lot of time. Of course, that's what I thought until I discovered Descript. Descript is an all-in-one tool for podcasters who are looking to record, edit, screen record, and transcribe their podcasts to make the podcast pre- and post-production process so much easier. In fact, I recently discovered that signing up with Descript's creator account is far more cost-effective and time-effective for me when it comes to transcribing my hour-long recordings compared to transcription-only services. A creator account allows me to transcribe up to 10 hours of audio. If you were to compare that with other transcription services that could be charging anywhere between 10 to 25 cents per minute, you'd be spending tons more money. But not only are transcriptions a huge part of my content development process, but Descript matches the written transcription with the audio waveform within the app itself to allow you to delete words from the transcription and the audio file. So for those of you who hate filler words, Descript has a nifty tool to eliminate all the ums and uhs from your recording. Whether you're using Descript to record or edit a podcast, or you're using it for transcription services only, you'll find that you'll use the app more and more as it makes your life easier by helping you save time and money. To get started with a free trial of Descript, head to my affiliate link at thepodcasttherapist.com/getdescript. All episodes of The Podcast Therapist are created using a Rocketbook. Rocketbooks are reusable notebooks that you would use with friction pens. And what they do is they allow you to take notes in the entire notebook. Then when you're finished with that notebook, you take the app that they have available for iPhone and Android, and you can scan your notes directly into the cloud. Your notes can be saved to Google Drive, Dropbox, OneDrive, or wherever. And after you've uploaded your notes to the cloud, you can erase your Rocketbook with a spray bottle of water and a cloth, and then reuse your notebook again. And if you need to refer to your old notes, you just go back to the cloud and see what you had written down. Rocketbook is powering the next generation of ideas. Save your notes, save the planet with Rocketbook. Check out my affiliate link at thepodcasttherapist.com/Rocketbook. To a lot of you, coffee is the nectar of the morning wake-up gods, right? I totally love that feeling, just like you, of being awake, especially as I get older. Adulting tends to get a little bit harder. It wasn't until I made a visit to the doctor a few years back and I was diagnosed with hypothyroidism, and I had to give up all of the caffeine in my life, including coffee. You see, even though caffeine can wake you up and make you feel alive for some part of the morning, it also has side effects like the jitters, anxiety, and you'll get terrible sleep, all of the things that I was experiencing. That's when I discovered Mud Water. Mud Water is a coffee replacement with 1/7 the caffeine of coffee that actually gives me energy, focus, and immunity without jitters, crashes, or a downside. So what's in it? Mud Water is a mixture of herbs, spices, and magic mushrooms that dial in on your immunity, boost your clarity, creativity, and your mood. I can't tell you how much of a difference it has made in my life in the last few months. So lose the jitters and find more focus with Mud Water. Get your Mud Water starter kit today at thepodcasttherapist.com/mudwater. That's thepodcasttherapist.com/MUDWTR to learn more and get your first can and frother today.
Unnecessary explanations.
The Podcast Therapist. Unnecessary explanations.
So I want to go over a couple things in today's unnecessary explanations segment. We'll just get the first one out of the way. You heard me at the beginning of today's interview with Jimmy that I introduced him as the Snob Vila of Phoenix, Arizona, and that was not me teasing him or anything like that. That was all part of an inside joke that we had before I pressed record on the on my recording software, and it was all based around this conversation we had where Jimmy was talking about how he was remodeling his entire home, gutting it from inside out, starting it from brand new. And so and he was doing it on his own. He wasn't hiring people. He was doing it on his own. And I just thought that was pretty amazing to see that there's a guy who actually still has skills to this day. I told him, God, here you are, ripping out walls and countertops, and I have a hard time just putting in a doorbell. So that's why I called him the Snob Vila, because he gave himself that nickname just before we hit record on today's podcast. So I thought you should be let in on that. And those of you who are regular listeners of of my podcast, let's address the very obvious of today's podcast. Now, you're hearing a lot more ads in today's podcast. You're hearing a lot more affiliate links being dropped inside of the podcast itself, and I completely know where you might be when it comes down to listening to the podcast. I know that you might say like, oh God, there's commercials now in this podcast. Yeah, and I get that. I understand that. But I think with the research that I have read, from whether it be from Edison Research or Triton Digital, most listeners are cool with ads being read inside of a podcast. Now, for the most part, though, the ads that are inside of my podcast, the Podcast Therapist, a lot of these are affiliate links. So for the person who is going to come in and listen to this podcast for the first time, the ads just aren't any ads. These are ads that are specifically targeted to help you, the podcaster, who is trying to turn the podcast into some type of business. So any tool that I am mentioning in an ad or a commercial has purpose. And I want to make sure that what I am creating, if there are going to be affiliate links and ads inside of the podcast, that the links and the ads have purpose and they are going to help you out, because these are tools that I'm using and I think that they would help you in the content development process. So you're going to hear this probably for the next, who knows, for the foreseeable future. Maybe there won't be ads. I don't know. But that leads me to the next step. You have heard me mention in this podcast that the podcast comes as ad-free and in its entirety over at thepodcasttherapist.com/ad-free. And I have mentioned the service before on a previous episode. I know maybe it was last episode or the previous episode before that, where I talked about utilizing a software like Supercast. And that is what I have gone with creating an ad-free version of the Podcast Therapist. It's ad-free, but it is also in its entirety. And so the content that I'm going to be sharing in the free version of the Podcast Therapist, I want to try to make it as valuable as possible for the person who is going to be coming in. Even if they have to fast forward through the ads, I certainly do understand that. But my goal is to hopefully have you contribute and support me on the other end of the ad-free version. The ad-free version, I believe for right now, is only $5.99 to get the ad-free version, and you get the interviews and the everything all up front, as opposed to having to wait week by week to get, the second half of the interview, or maybe more detail as to what I'm sharing in an episode. I might leave some details out of an episode. I haven't decided on what I'm going to be doing with that yet. But for the most part, you would be supporting me on that back end, that backside, because I'm still a one-man show when it comes down to creating podcast content. I'm still a one-man show when it comes down to having clients. I'm a one-man show here in this little home office that I have here in Phoenix. And so I would like to eventually grow into having a team. So that's why you're starting to hear the ads, but the ads are hopefully going to give you the opportunity to support me in some way, shape, or form by going on over to thepodcasttherapist.com/ad-free and subscribing and contributing money to what it is that I am creating. Now, as an idea of what happens on my end when it comes down to creating podcasts, as I mentioned, because I am a one-man show, there are specific days in which I have to get content done, because I don't batch record my content, even though I recommend that you do. But I don't personally batch record my content because there's news that sometimes I like to release or read the day before I release a podcast so that I can share it with you so it's as up to date as possible. So it's a little more time sensitive. But when it comes down to it, there are specific days in which I develop content, and there's days where I'm very, very much off the radar. People have reached out to me over the weekend, or maybe they have reached out to me on a Monday, Tuesday, and they have not heard back from me. And those typically tend to be my podcast content development days. This does not even include my client work that I have to accomplish as well. So I think that's just something that I think you should know. What goes into developing the Podcast Therapist takes a lot of thought. It's a lot of research. It's a lot of hours. The editing process is not very much. It's not very long for me. In fact, the editing process for the podcast takes me probably maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes to create that, and then I'm publishing within minutes after that. So it's not the editing process for me. It is the research content development process that I go into, because I try to develop content that is meaningful for you, the listener, so that you can take it and run with it, or that you can come back to it and take notes and then try to execute upon it. So that is really where my energies go. It goes into the research and development of the podcasts themselves. This is just not about the research and development of the podcast. This also goes for my YouTube channel. And that is a lot more work when it comes down to developing video content. So when I first decided that I wanted to start a podcast, an audio version of the podcast, I was like, oh boy, this is going to be a challenge, but I'm up for the challenge, and we'll see where I can go from there, because I knew what it took to create video content, and was I ready and willing to add audio on top of that game. I knew what it was going to take to produce it on my own, but that's what it was. So just as a kind of, I guess, a peek into what my week looks like. Monday is typically the day in which I'm doing the research for my podcast. Sundays, you can include Sundays in there as well. All right. So Sundays and Mondays, I'm typically including a couple of hours of research for the podcast itself, if I don't have an interview whatsoever. Okay. So I'll go in and I'll scour the internet for valuable pieces of content that I think need to be addressed, so that I can fill that hole in a search engine. So that might take me 2 to 3 hours tops, maybe sometimes 4. But you have to also include my daily life and what I do personally. Okay, so this includes like just personal things, cooking, cleaning, exercising. For me, exercise is a big thing. I dedicate 1 hour a day to exercise, and then of course, if you exercise and you do 1 hour a day, that's really more like an hour and a half of your time that you have to take to cool down, clean up, take a shower, come back, and then get back into the groove to develop content. So the weeks are very, very, they're very packed for me as far as Mondays and Tuesdays are concerned. And then Wednesdays, I obviously release the YouTube video. And then I dedicate Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays for researching guests and trying to find the right guests that I want to bring onto these podcasts. Because I just don't want to invite anyone onto my podcast. I want to invite people that will help you develop a better podcast. So within that time period, I'm looking and doing show research for the next week's podcast. But we have to also remember, like I mentioned, I am editing other people's podcasts on those days as well. So the days are very packed for me. And when you're including all of my personal things that I do, the exercise, the food prep, whatever it may be, it can become a challenge. And what my goal is to do is to try to hire a team, to get a team to do some of this stuff for me. Like, I'll record the podcast and then I can ship it off and have someone edit it, or I can record my videos and then I can ship all those files off and someone can edit my video files. But for right now, it's just me. It's a one-man band, and I'm just doing what I can. You probably can relate because you are in the same space. So that is why you're hearing more ads in the podcast itself, is because it's not to annoy you. It's meant to help those who are looking for that information based off of someone who has been producing podcasts for a long time. But it is my hope that you will move over to the paid version of the podcast Pet Therapist to not only get the ad-free version, but just to contribute and support the efforts that it takes for me to develop these pieces of content for you. I do my very best every week to try to create the best content for you. And I know there are days where I just fall short. I fall short on not developing the best piece of content for you. But it's always my desire when I go in and I try to research a piece of content for sharing, that I'm giving you the best and the most valuable piece of content that you can take with you. Take notes with it, come back to the podcast, listen to it, and then, of course, jump on over and implement it into your own podcast. So again, your support would really help out. That is why you're going to be hearing, for the foreseeable future, more ads, more of my ads for affiliate links for the products and services that I use for my own podcast. And I think they'll help you out as well. And they're always worth trying out if you have not checked out some of those ads and gone in and checked some of those affiliate links out. A lot of you have, but if you have not, I recommend you go check them out. But if you don't want to hear the podcast, again, you can check out the ad-free version and you'll get the episodes in their entirety. That is my goal. My goal is to provide the entire episode, practically unedited, so that, most of my podcasts anyway are unedited. But for the most part, you would be getting them in their entirety. And there's an Ask Me Anything section on the area in which I'm holding that membership. And you can ask me anything. But also, if you're looking to maybe go for a year's worth of your time to subscribe to my podcast and you want to show your support there is an option to get into a year's membership subscription. And I will add in some more value for you so that you can take it with you and help yourself into building a podcast business. I've got my audiobook, 6 Clever Ways to Monetize a Podcast. I've got softwares that you will need to build out a podcast business. And then I've got a, what is it called? I forgot what it is. Even I wrote it out. It's website tools that you will end up needing. I'm thinking, is it tools? Let me look at here it is. I've got it here right here. It's my website business roadmap. I don't know why I forgot what that says. It's a website business roadmap, and it shares with you step by step the exact steps that I took to build out what I have as considered a business for my podcast. It gives you the roadmap. I've written it all out in a guide along with an actual checklist of steps that you will need to take in order before you can take the next step to grow your business. So the website business roadmap will come free with the 6 Clever Ways to Monetize a Podcast audiobook and softwares as service that you will need for your podcast business. So again, I encourage you to go check it out and learn more about how you can support me and my content development efforts at thepodcasttherapist.com/ad-free. And I would really appreciate it. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. I really appreciate it. And of course, next week, if you're listening to the ad-supported version, I'll be sharing with you the second half of my interview with Jimmie Whisman of the Crime and Sports and Small Town Murder podcast. And he actually is going to get into some really inspirational parts of the interview that hopefully that will push you in the right direction to developing a podcast that is sustainable over time. That is exactly what he has done. But if you want to hear that full interview, head on over to the ad-free version and you could check it out for yourself. In the meantime, thank you guys so much for even supporting me and listening to this episode. It means so much to me. I appreciate it regardless. And thank you so much. Make sure that if you want to ask me a question, you can reach me at thepodcasttherapist.com and scroll down. You can check out the Contact Me section. And that will give you access to my voicemail where you can leave me a voicemail or just email me. So in the meantime, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your week. We'll be talking to you next time. Take care.
The Podcast Therapist.
Mixdown Media Productions.